What's up, everyone? Father Charles here. Welcome to another episode of Catholic Themes and Tolkien. Today we're going to talk about Tolkien's environmental stewardship, sort of his Catholic-flavored environmental sensitivities, which were several decades ahead of their time. And I'm going to argue here that Tolkien's environmental sensitivities, as it were, his beautiful depiction of the earth and all of the wonderful landscapes of Middle-earth, and just the fact that Tolkien's book sort of has a very decidedly green hues. It's one of the things that people love about Tolkien. I'm going to argue that Tolkien's environmental sensitivities were not in spite of, but because of the fact that he was Catholic. Kind of like the friendship chapter. There's wonderful ways to depict friendship. Friendship is not something that Catholics or Christians have a monopoly on, of course. But there certainly is a very developed sense of stewardship of the earth and reverence for the earth as a creature, a wonderful creature of God, that Tolkien, I think, had sort of absorbed, and they became absorbed into the story. So I'm going to talk about that, and lots of good quotes from Tolkien and his books. I've said before that discussing and finding passages in The Lord of the Rings about the beauty of nature is kind of like finding passages about God in the Bible because they're so pervasive. So Tolkien was several decades ahead of his time. I want to talk about that and just talk about some of the ways that the scriptures and the Catholic tradition influenced Tolkien's distinctive form of environmental stewardship and sensitivity. So Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published in 1962, documenting the harmful effects of pesticides in the environment and helping to launch what we know today as the environmental movement. 50 years later, 60 years later now, going green is not only culturally accepted, but it's even fashionable, at least when it does not entail too many difficult life choices. Recycling, global climate change, deforestation, soil degradation, pollution, ozone depletion, industrial food production, sustainability. These are all common terms in today's lingo. But it's sometimes easy for us to forget that Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings from 1937 through about 1950. It got published in 1954. And so we forget sometimes just how ahead of his time Tolkien was. The emerging environmental movement of the last decades has proceeded largely along secular terms. And leaders in the movement have generally considered, the Christian churches to be somewhat unhelpful because we have this otherworldly perspective, we're heading for heaven anyway, so who cares what happens to the earth in the end? It's sort of that Johnny Cash song, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. Texts such as Genesis 1 and 2 are frequently cited as supposed rationalizations for industrialist exploitation and domination of the earth. God said, fill the earth and subdue it. God gave them dominion over the creatures of the earth, to name a couple of texts that are grossly misappropriated and taken out of context. But at any rate, the fact that many of the leading industrialists of the past decades last centuries, I should say, were putative Christians or in league with church leaders who were happy to receive their donations and thus reluctant to criticize their excesses did not help matters. But there have been some voices which have, significant voices which have noticed that maybe the rift between the environmental movement and the Christians has not always been helpful. In fact, Karl Pope, the former executive director of the Sierra Club, has admitted and in fact repented of this rift between faith groups and environmental leaders. He writes about attending a conference in California on the intersection of faith and the environment, which was hosted by ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, sometimes called the Green Patriarch. Read some of his stuff. He's been really one of the leading faith leaders anyway. I forgive my lack of eloquence, but he's been considered one of the leading faith dudes that has talked about the need for Christians to bring the light of their tradition and their faith into dialogue with the environmental movement. We should be a headlight, not a tail light in this thing. Anyway, this is what Karl Pope said. My generation of environmentalists had sinned. We had walked away from the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, and the temples, from the very institutions to which millions of people turn when seeking to live out their deepest values. And we thereby risked turning the environmental ethic into an environmental subculture. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings mostly during the 1940s, when the environmental movement was just before the environmental movement was beginning in earnest. So Tolkien's striking descriptions of the landscapes and trees, the glens and glades, the mountains and forests of Middle-earth beam with love and fervor toward the natural world and bristle with ire for those who would mar, taint, exploit, or destroy it. Tolkien leads his readers page by page through the pre-industrial agrarian Shire, the untamed majesty of the misty mountains, the sweet grass of Rohan with its magnificent horses. He painfully shows us the deforesting rapine of Saruman and the blighted wastelands of Mordor. He makes us feel the sentient anger of trees and their righteous wrath at their two-legged foes, and even introduces us to a race of tree people called Ents, who are given literary power to finally unleash some righteous wrath against their callous oppressors. So from the first publication of The Lord of the Rings in the 1950s up to the present day, Tolkien's artful environmentalism has been among the subversive quality of the books that have proven most endearing to readers. And this includes both secular readers, religious readers alike. It's one of the great unifying points of Tolkien among many, between believers, non-believers, people of all stripes. So where did Tolkien get his environmental sensitivities? I think that's a fair question to ask. Well, of course, you know where this is going. It's called Catholic Themes and Tolkien. How did this thoroughly unmodern man, JRR Tolkien, come to articulate so powerfully what would become the dominant concerns of modern environmentalists? To reply that Tolkien loved the old and hated the new, or had an antipathy for all things modern, or nursed a patent dislike for machines and industrial accoutrements. All right, sorry. Kind of having a hard time getting started this morning. This is kind of simplistic. I've heard this from people before. Well, Tolkien, he was anti-modern, man. He liked the old, he didn't like the new. Or he was a Luddite. Those people that just destroyed the machines. Anyway, no, I'm afraid it's a little bit more subtle than that. In fact, it's a lot more subtle than that. The deeper question is, where did his views come from? Where did they originate? The fact is that they are largely rooted in a Catholic Christian worldview. That this may come as a surprise or even as a shock to many is really evidence of how far Christians have failed to understand and articulate their own traditions and how poorly we have been educated lately on such matters. So allow me to try my best to fill in some of the gaps. So I'm going to talk about Tolkien's particular brand of environmentalism, highlighting many passages from The Lord of the Rings. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the Judeo-Christian roots and maybe some of the origins of where Tolkien got some of his thoughts and ideas. So, Gospel of John, just to start somewhere. Chapter 15. During the last words of Jesus to his disciples, which are often called the farewell discourse, several chapters where Jesus just kind of speaks at the Last Supper to his disciples. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. My Father is the gardener, and you are the branches, you are to bear much fruit. The image has an added power given its context, which is, as I said, the Last Supper, perhaps even given as Jesus is instituting the Eucharist, taking the cup and saying, this is the blood of the new covenant which will be given up for you. The image of the vine makes us think of soil, grapes, and of course, wine. The vineyard theme is ubiquitous in the Gospels. The kingdom of God is described in so many parables that use vineyard imagery. The kingdom of God is the seed, our hearts are the soil. Care of one's soul is likened to the tending of a vineyard. The first miracle of Jesus is to turn 6 stone jars of water into wine for a wedding feast, wine being throughout the Bible. A metaphor for grace, the Messianic era being established through Christ and heaven. Moreover, something that is striking to any reader of the Gospels is just how earth and nature-based all of the imagery is. Think of the parable of the sower, or the parable of the mustard seed, or all the other seed analogies. Jesus talks about the mixture of good and evil within the community of the church in terms of weeds and wheat. The end times are described as the final harvest. Jesus uses the lilies of the field and the birds of the air as a sign of trust in God's providence. Jesus uses images from farming and animal husbandry, calling himself the Good Shepherd, and saying, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And then there is all of the water symbolism. Baptism, the living water, Jesus speaks about with the Samaritan woman at the well, or when he says that from the heart of the believer will flow rivers of living water. The imagery of the earth and its goodness is found not just in the Gospels, but throughout the Bible. In the first pages of Genesis, paradise is described as the Garden of Eden. God creates the earth and the sea, the living things, the plants and the animals, and after each creation, it says that God saw that it was good. In fact, we're told that God took the man, Adam, and settled him in the garden in order to cultivate it and care for it. And the Hebrew words here do not suggest exploitation or domination, as this passage is often frequently misquoted as saying or misrepresented as saying. It is not the exploitation and domination of modern industrialism. This is the unfortunate default position for many. Rather, these words that are used in the Hebrew imply caretaking and stewardship. The earth is a beautiful garden which God has given to man as a gift to be loving and gratefully received, to be tended and lovingly cared for so as to yield its fruit. This is where the word stewardship comes from. This is why we talk about environmental stewardship. In the Christian understanding, a steward is not an owner. A steward is somebody who manages or cares for something that's been entrusted for a time by an owner. And so we're going to one day render an account to God for how well we tended and cared for and stewarded this good earth that he gave us, that he asked us to make yield fruit for our benefit. So it's not domination, it's not exploitation, it's not the modern industrialist sense. It's this loving stewarding, caretaking. We recognize that we're under God, we're under an owner, and one day we're going to render an account. How well have we done? Well, Tolkien seems to think we haven't done very well. His story was a beautiful poetic and literary way of demonstrating this and inspiring us to maybe do a little bit better of a job. At the end of the Bible, as the last chapters of the very fantastic and sort of apocalyptic imagery of the book of Revelation come to a close, we see that in the midst of the new and eternal Jerusalem is the river of life, flowing crystal clear down the middle of the city street. On either side of the river were the trees of life, which bear 12 crops of fruit a year, one in each month, and the leaves of which are the cures for many diseases. So this is heaven. It's not described in terms of clouds, and floating angels. It's described in terms of a city, not a post-industrialist city, but a city and rivers and trees. Think about it. What city do you know in which a river, a clean river of life, flows right down the middle with trees that bear fruit, whose leaves yield medicine for the healing of the nations? This is beautiful imagery. This is earthbound imagery to describe heaven. I think we often miss this. The Bible seems to favor a highly positive view of the earth, portrayed as our God-given home. Through the soil, seeds, rivers, and waterways, trees, plants, and animals, God provides everything necessary to live a good, healthy, and sustainable life. Many of the Psalms offer hymns of blessing and praise for these natural gifts. In the Christian understanding, God is portrayed as a good and gracious Father who gives to his people the beautiful gift of an earth filled with bounty and life. So the Catholic tradition, I want to talk about that here for a minute. I've talked about the Bible in general. The Catholic tradition throughout the centuries has expanded on these themes and, in fact, has usually taken them for granted. Monastic institutions were self-sustaining and included both ora and labora, as the great Latin phrase says, ora being prayer, labora being work, according to the ideal of St. Benedict, who's considered kind of the founder of monasticism. The work included study of scripture and manuscript copying, to be sure, but it also involved tending the earth and cultivating its fruits. The monasteries were self-sustaining. Scholars like St. Albert the Great lovingly observed the natural world and charted their findings in the 13th century, long before the modern scientific method. In fact, Catholics were some of the first naturalists. You can think about some of the Jesuit priests in the 15 and 1600s also. St. Francis of Assisi penned his famous Canticle of the Creatures, Brother Sun, Sister Moon, etc. One of the most beautiful hymns of reverent praise for the creation ever written in the Christian tradition. In fact, Laudato Si, which is how this canticle begins, is how Pope Francis entitled his document on care and creation of the earth, our common home. I actually wrote this book and the contents that I'm explaining to you in this video long before this document came out. We could spend a whole other video just talking about it. It's an incredibly dense, comprehensive view of sort of the Catholic idea of Christian stewardship, and it's amazing. If you haven't read it, strongly encourage you to do so. Tolkien's fellow countryman and man of letters, the 19th century Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins, poet. He was elegizing England and its natural beauties and lamenting their peril before Tolkien was even born. Many beautiful poems from him talk about the beauty of the earth. Binsey poplars, for instance. He mourns the aspens dear, which were felled, all felled, exclaiming, "Oh, if we but knew what we do when we delve or hew, hack and rack the growing green." In God's grandeur, he begins with the affirmation, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. And yet, after such a joyous exultation, he bemoans the results where generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And this last line might even perhaps evoke Tolkien's hobbits, with their thick-soled, hairy, unshod feet. And one might even wonder if there's a hint of literary influence here. Who knows? The 20th century Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, he included Hopkins among his short list of theologians of glory, whose exceptional perception of the beauty of God's revelation made them models for his proposed renewal of what he calls theological aesthetics. I know just enough von Balthasar to be dangerous, so I give you that caveat here. But anyway, he argues that the convert Hopkins administers through his what he calls sacramental poetry. I think Tolkien could be considered in this tradition as well. The great inheritance of the English tradition, both spiritual and literary, by, quote, bringing home to Mother Church a thoroughly appropriated tradition rooted in the classics but ranging from Duns Scotus, Shakespeare, Milton, Purcell, all the way through the Romantics and up to the present. To these, Hopkins added as well, quote, the knife edge of the mutual election that takes place between God and man, gleaned from his Ignatian spirituality as a Jesuit. Particularly striking is Balthasar's description of Hopkins' unique primeval experience that characterizes him as poet and man, making such an impact on his readers. This is what Balthasar says at some length, writing about the poetry of Hopkins. From the poems, the diaries and letters, there breathes everywhere uniquely and unmistakably the English countryside. Woods, hills, green upon green, always a strong wind, driving clouds, the closeness to the sea, the moors and highlands, with quick-flowing brooks and heather, the surge of the waves, islands wild, and yet with a southern mildness. But it is no cultural landscape, not at all a romantic or mythological landscape, but as it were a primeval landscape. So to what degree Hopkins may or may not have influenced Tolkien, that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But both authors were deeply influenced by both the English and the Catholic traditions. And while the priest Hopkins and the layman father of four, Tolkien, obviously differed in their personal vocations, there are strong affinities between the two. Both were devout Catholics and professors steeped in the classics. Both taught ancient languages, and for each, Oxford University featured prominently. Hopkins was educated there, and Tolkien spent most of his adult life teaching there. Both shared a reverence for the English countryside and a regret over its peril for modern industrialism. Both were original advocates for the natural world, and both used their respective literary mastery to promote a refined and sophisticated Catholic environmentalism, which has proven remarkably prescient and relevant to modern concerns. Whew. All right, well, hopefully that gives a little bit of background. Some of you might be thinking, Father Charles, all I care about is Tolkien. Can we get to the good stuff? And of course we will. That's what we're going to get into now. But I think it's important to talk about this, kind of like in the sacramentality section. I quoted at length, with some of Tolkien's own sort of faith struggles, the fact that he was a very devout but not uncritical Catholic. I think it's important to understand how Tolkien wrestled with some of these things, because then we can appreciate how they made it into his literature. And again, if you're just skimming the surface, or if you're just kind of educated by the common mentality, which most of us are, you don't know that the Catholics have this tradition. Sometimes we think, getting back to that Karl Pope quote, that all of the environmentalists, and only the environmentalists who give a hoot about the environment, they're all secular. Well, it's not exactly true. Actually, concern and reverence for the created world that God has given to us, this is actually something deeply rooted in the Catholic tradition. And again, it says a lot about our ideological, politicized world today that may come as a surprise to many. So let's get into the Lord of the Rings now and see how this plays out. I want to talk about Elvish versus Sarumanic approaches to nature and reality here. That may sound like a mouthful, and it probably is. But I think the elves have a certain approach, and Saruman and his minions have a certain approach. And I think these two sort of typify two approaches to nature and reality that were deeply imbued within Tolkien's worldview and in his artistic style. So underlying Tolkien's environmentalism is an appreciation for God-given reality in and of itself, rather than merely as a raw material or tool for advancing human schemes. The 20th century Trappist monk and Catholic spiritual author Thomas Merton once observed the following: "There are some men for whom a tree has no reality until they think of cutting it down, for whom an animal has no value until it enters the slaughterhouse. Men who never look at anything until they decide to abuse it, and who never even notice what they do not want to destroy. Because they do not know the silence of love, they cannot know the silence of God, who is charity." This is from No Man is an Island by Thomas Merton. Merton laments how we have failed to learn to truly see and hear things in themselves, and not just as objects for our use. Merton's description of some men might readily describe the spirit of Sauron, or most especially of Saruman. According to Treebeard, Saruman has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things except as far as they serve him for the moment. In the course of his conversation with Merry and Pippin, Treebeard recognizes the extent of the damage inflicted by Saruman, who has been wantonly tearing down trees to feed the fires of his military-industrial complex in Isengard. Earlier, as Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli pursued Saruman's Uruk-hai, They needed little skill picking up the trail. Legolas observed, "No other folk make such a trampling. It seems their delight to slash and beat down growing things that are not even in their way." Treebeard comes to realize, in spite of his unhastiness, that action must be taken against the black traitor Saruman. Treebeard realizes that he has failed in his stewardship as shepherd of the trees. Down on the borders, they are felling trees, good trees. Some of the trees they just cut down and leave to rot. Roused to action at last by Merry and Pippin, he goes forth with the remainder of his kin, seeking justice and restitution at the last march of the Ents. Merton would likely have approved the opposing and, to his mind, more suitable approach toward nature and reality embodied in Tolkien's elves. Rivendell and Lothlorien are portrayed as oases of tenderly cared for and highly cultivated natural beauty. In Lothlorien, we encounter the Malorn trees, whose silver trunks give way to flowering boughs and golden leaves which remain throughout winter. Treebeard credits the elves with waking the trees up and teaching them to speak. He gratefully acknowledged their curing us of dumbness long ago, a great gift that cannot be forgotten, though our ways have parted since. Tolkien once wrote of the elves in a letter that they represent the artistic, aesthetic, and purely scientific aspects of the humane nature raised to a higher level than is actually seen in men. That is, they have a devoted love of the physical world and a desire to observe and understand it for its own sake as other, as a reality derived from God in the same degree as themselves, not as material for use or as a power platform. Especially interesting is what Tolkien says next. He says, the elves also possess a sub-creational or artistic faculty of great excellence. So he seems to be positing a link between the elvish ability to observe reality as other and excellence in artistic creation. Clearly, Tolkien aspired to this elvish gift as well, and perhaps his own creativity is not unrelated to his cultivation of this sort of what I'll call elvish detachment. Further insight into this elvish versus Sarumanic approach to reality and nature can be seen in Tolkien's very insightful On Fairy Stories essay. Tolkien draws a distinction between art and magic. This is very instructive to me and very interesting. He says, art is an elvish craft by which a secondary world can be created, inside of which both designer and spectator can enter with delight and satisfaction. In Tolkien's view, fantasy as literature, fairy story if you will, aspires to and approaches enchantment when successful as art. Advocacy of this type of fantasy was Tolkien's chief aim in his essay, and the creation of this type of fantasy was the chief aim of Tolkien's fiction. Magic, on the other hand, produces an alteration in the primary world. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. Elsewhere, Tolkien links magic to the machine, capital M, machine, exhibiting, quote, the desire for power, for making the will more quickly effective, and which includes all use of external plans or apparatus instead of development of inner talents, or even the use of these talents with the corrupted motive of dominating, bulldozing the real world or coercing other wills. The machine is our more obvious modern form, though more closely related to magic than is usually recognized. So basically, art is elvish, magic is mechanistic. Sarumanic, if you will. The former aims to delight, art aims to delight, but the machine, the Sarumanic element, aims simply to dominate. The one is concerned with beauty, art, the other is concerned merely with power. The former is embodied in Tolkien's best fiction, and the latter is embodied in The Ring itself. So while speaking once of the planners and their urbanizing of rural England, Tolkien once said, the spirit of Isengard, if not of Mordor, is of course always cropping up. And elsewhere he said, I look east, west, north, and south, and I do not see Sauron, but I see that Saruman has many descendants. He went on to say, my gentle hobbits, I give you this toast. To the hobbits, may they outlast the Sarumans and see spring again in the trees. So Tolkien saw sort of the march of modern industrialism as kind of this dialectic between Saruman and the hobbits. I thought that's very interesting. Here we're reminded of the scouring of the Shire and the triumph of the hobbits over the blighting of the Shire that had been orchestrated and overseen by the perversity of Saruman and his last gasp of treachery. Again, this part didn't make it into the movies, but it features very prominently in the book. In contrast, a beautiful example of Elvish detachment in The Lord of the Rings arises somewhat ironically in the dwarf, Gimli. At the fulfillment of Galadriel's prophetic blessing over him that his hand shall flow with gold, and yet over him gold shall have no dominion. So as we know, the dwarves have a particular weakness for treasure and have been known to delve too deep in their zeal, with dire consequences such as awakening the Balrogs in the depths of Moria. In the Road to Isengard chapter, Gimli's heart has been ravished by what he's seen in the beautiful caverns of Helm's Deep. His inner poet, awakened in Lothlorien, is growing more eager and articulate as he shares with Legolas, with whom he's becoming fast friends, his dreams to return to Helm's Deep with his kin one day. And to this, Legolas objects. He says, "One family of busy dwarves with hammer and chisel might mar more than they made." And then a reverent Gimli gives this response. "No, you do not understand. No dwarf can be unmoved by such loveliness. None of Durin's race would mine those caves for stones or ore. Not if diamonds and gold could be got there. Do you cut down groves of blossoming trees in the springtime for firewood? We would tend these glades of flowering stone, not quarry them. With cautious skill, tap by tap, a small chip of rock, and no more perhaps than a whole anxious day. So we could work, and as the years went by, we should open up new ways." At this, even the skeptical Legolas has to admit that he is moved, and he makes a deal with Gimli. Should they survive the war and see the quest accomplished, they will journey to the respective places that each holds most dear, Fangorn Forest and the caves of Helm's Deep. Their friendship is deepened, and they are willing to visit what is naturally repugnant to themselves out of reverence and friendship for the other. Detachment has now opened the door to new viewpoints, openness, and mutual appreciation. How beautiful. A detachment of a different but no less important sort is seen in the Hobbits. For Gandalf, the ideal character for the task of destroying the ring would be a representative from the Shire. The Hobbit's simplicity rooted in the agrarian life, a lack of ambition regarding worldly affairs, small stature. These traits give them a particular immunity to the temptations of the ring, which capitalized and fed on the grasping ego of its possessor. It was Sam, the genuine hobbit, about whom we spoke a lot in the last segment, who even more than Frodo embodied the Shire. After Frodo's capture, Sam must take the ring on his own, and he experiences some temptations, and for a moment it says wild fantasies arose in his mind. However, for Sam, these fantasies don't involve the domination of other wills, but rather the power to command healing in the tortured vale of Gorgoroth, which under his fantasized rule became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He overcomes this hour of trial not only by his love for his master, but by his simplicity, by his plain hobbit sense. So we see that even Sam's imagination is thoroughly Shire-formed, and his power fantasies involve fecundity and fruit. His love for what is other, a small garden of a free gardener, neutralize in the end the hazardous conceits of his ego and support his victory over the ring. And he says, and anyway, all these notions are only a trick. His moral victory accomplished, he never looks back. Sam will later bring healing, fecundity, and restoration back to the Saruman decimated Shire, using the special gift of the small wooden box of Elvish soil, given him as a parting gift from Lothlorien by Galadriel, the Lady of the Wood. I love how the little box has a G on it. She says it stands for Galadriel, but it can also stand for garden or gardener, which you are, Samwise Gamgee. She knew that Sam was the perfect one to bring this back. And of course, there's the Malorn tree that is planted after the decimated Shire is reclaimed by the hobbits, and that beautiful spring in which everything begins to grow again. Wonderful depiction by Tolkien. In contrast to these examples of detachment are Tolkien's incredible descriptions of the blight of Sauron's domination. Whereas Saruman's utilitarian view of nature cares for growing things as far as they serve him for the moment, in Sauron we see the next level, perverse delight taken in abuse. Among the more memorable descriptions of Sauron's blight and destruction is this one taken from the Passage of the Marshes. I'm going to quote it at some length because it's so powerful and beautiful. Well, it's actually not beautiful, it's very ugly, but it's beautiful in the way it describes the ugliness. Frodo looked round in horror. Dreadful as the dead marshes had been, and the arid moors of the no-man lands, more loathsome far was the country that the crawling day now slowly unveiled to his shrinking eyes. Here neither spring nor summer would ever come again. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about. High mounds of crushed rock, great cones of earth, fire-blasted and poison-stained, stood like an obscene graveyard in endless rows, slowly revealed in the reluctant light. They had come to the desolation that lay before Mordor, the lasting monument to the dark labor of its slaves that should endure when all their purposes were made void. A land defiled, diseased beyond all healing, unless the great sea should enter in and wash it with oblivion. I feel sick, said Sam. Frodo did not speak. Whew. Descriptions of environmental apocalypse do not come much more striking and unsettling than this one. Yet against such blighted depictions stands the tree, one of Tolkien's most beloved, iconic, and subversive symbols. Advancing his philosophy of trees, Tolkien once wrote, "I am obviously much in love with plants, and above all, trees, and have always been, and I find human maltreatment of them as hard to bear as some find the ill treatment of animals." We see this love in all of Tolkien's writings, the tree. In the Silmarillion, two great trees depicted with virtuosic literary description, Laurelin and Telperion, light up the world until they are cruelly slain by Melkor and Ungoliant, a giant spider. The world goes dark. That passage in the Silmarillion is incredible. In Leaf by Nigel, Tolkien's semi-autobiographical short story, Nigel's life is consumed by his ever-expanding painting of a leaf, which turns into a tree, which turns into an increasingly complex landscape. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, from the party tree in the Shire, to the Old Forest, to the great woods of Lothlorien, to Treebeard and the Ents and the Huorns, to the White Tree of Gondor, to the Malorn that springs triumphantly from the bruised and battered destruction of the Shire in the spring of SR 1420, the great year of plenty. The tree is a consistent symbol of nature filled with promise, yet standing all too often without advocate or defender, imperiled by the thoughtlessness of modernity's grasping, irresponsible power. In the Fellowship of the Ring, as Frodo enters Lothlorien and makes ready to follow Haldir to the safety of the Flet, in the boughs high above, he lays his hand upon one of the trees to the following effect. This is what it says. Never before had he been so suddenly and so keenly aware of the feel and texture of a tree's skin and of the life within it. He felt a delight in the wood and the touch of it. Neither as forester nor as carpenter, it was the delight of the living tree itself. Tolkien's delight of the living tree itself seems to mirror Frodo's. He seems eager to evangelize future advocates of nature, which he does without moralism or heavy-handed polemics or ideology, but through story. Picking out passages on the dignity and beauty of nature in The Lord of the Rings, as we said, is a bit like picking out passages about God in the Bible. The entire work breathes respect and reverent affection towards nature. Through his detailed and lovingly realized Middle-earth with its scale maps, landscapes, histories, and unprecedented realism, Tolkien invites the reader into a similar experience as Frodo touching the tree in Lothlorien. Millions of readers have gratefully responded, their environmental sensitivities enlivened as a result. Finally, I just want to talk about some of the modern day articulations of which Tolkien was a forebear. Tolkien anticipated with remarkable foresight the more modern environmental concerns, which would only later make their way into the general consciousness. Remember, he was writing again several decades before Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and even before the church would make some more pointed pronouncements in ecclesiastical writings. In recent times, the teachings of the church have come to more and more explicitly affirm many of the insights which Tolkien effectively voiced through his literary art. So, for instance, Pope John Paul wrote, "One cannot use with impunity the animals, plants, and natural elements simply as one wishes according to one's own economic needs. On the contrary, one must take into account the nature of each being and its mutual connection in an ordered system, the cosmos." Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, who we talked about before, who has led many original and unique environmental initiatives, such that he's even been called the Green Patriarch. He once said, "Our current way of life is humanly and environmentally suicidal." Yet the crisis is not, first of all, ecological. It is a crisis in the way we perceive reality and relate to our world. We need an alternative way of seeing ourselves in relation to the natural world. He goes on to argue for a new asceticism, which involves valuing everything for itself and not simply for ourselves, regaining a sense of wonder and being filled with a sense of goodness. Pope Benedict XVI has said, "As long as the earth was seen as God's creation, the task of subduing it was never intended as an order to enslave it, but rather as a task of being stewards of creation and developing its gifts, of actively collaborating in God's work so that the gifts of creation might be appreciated rather than trampled upon and destroyed." As we observe, for example, in the monasteries, wherever the Creator's word was properly understood, wherever life was lived with the redeeming Creator, people strove to save creation and not to destroy it. Creation is groaning, we perceive it, we almost hear it, and it awaits human beings who will preserve it in accordance with God. That's Pope Benedict. He has overseen the installation of panels for solar energy for lighting, healing, and cooling, and at his request, the Vatican has become the first state in Europe to go completely carbon neutral. He's even seen that a patch of national park in Hungary be reforested in order to offset what is left of the Vatican's annual carbon dioxide emissions. In 2010, he dedicated his important annual New Year's World Day of Peace address to the theme, "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation," saying respect for creation is of immense consequence, not least because creation is the beginning and the foundation of all God's works. And its preservation has now become essential for the pacific coexistence of mankind. And then we come to Pope Francis. And again, we could be all day just talking about Pope Francis, but speaking after his election to the papacy in March 2013, he said in the choice of his papal name, "For me, he, St. Francis, is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. These days, we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we?" During his inaugural homily, he said, "I would like to ask all those who have positions of responsibility in economic, political, and social life, and all men and women of goodwill, let us be protectors of creation, protectors of God's plan inscribed in nature, protectors of one another and of the environment. Let us not allow omens of destruction and death to accompany the advance of this world." Comments like these indicate that, like his predecessors, he will continue to encourage environmental stewardship as a pastoral priority in the church, and indeed, he has done so. So all of this is simply to highlight that in the Catholic Christian consciousness, articulated lately in a much more comprehensive and precise manner, environmental stewardship is not a fashionable trend or an optional political ideology. Instead, it's a mandate of the gospel. Caring for the home that we live in, that God has given to us, that we have to pass on to future generations, hopefully for many, many, many centuries to come, this has moral implications. And there is simply no justification based on the scriptures and the tradition of the church for allying Christian theology with a sort of the Sarumanic dominating approach. For the serious Christian, being a disciple of Jesus has cosmic and ecological implications, which are ultimately lifestyle and moral implications. Tolkien would bristle at the idea of his story being reduced to any type of moralism, be it environmentalist, Catholic, or any other sort. He meant his story to be read and enjoyed just as that, a story. However, I don't think there's any irreverence in merely noting that the environmental sensitivities present in his story are largely because of and not in spite of his Catholic faith and imagination. So hopefully this has helped to shed some light on where Tolkien got some of his environmental sympathies, where the decidedly green hues of The Lord of the Rings come from, and just what a pioneer Tolkien was with regards to advancing, I think, a thoroughly Catholic-informed environmental stewardship.